Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly program. Today, we'll be speaking with the neurologist and financial theorist, William J. Bernstein, about religion and groupthink delusions.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Why do so many people seem to lose their reasoning abilities when they join a religious movement? Our guest today has an answer. William J. Bernstein is a retired neurologist who's now a financial theorist who writes about finance and economics. His best-selling books include The Birth of Plenty, about the institutional origins of modern prosperity, A Splendid Exchange, How Trade Shaped the World, and Masters of the Word, about how communications technology shaped history.
William Bernstein's latest book, The Delusions of Crowds, Why People Go Mad in Groups, tells the stories of both financial crazes and religious mass manias, and explores the evolutionary psychology and social psychology behind them. Welcome to Freethought Matters, William.
Glad to be with you.
I really loved your book. It's fascinating. It's a broad, well-documented history of different types of group mania. And you are both a neurologist and a financial theorist. So how did these two seemingly disparate fields prompt you to write a book about the delusions of crowds?
Well, about a quarter century ago, I read this book's predecessor, which is a book by a man by the name of Charles Mackay, Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it's a pretty well-known book, at least in finance circles. It describes religious manias and fashion and health manias, but it's best known for its description of the three great manias of the 17th and 18th century in England and France and Holland, particularly the Dutch tulip mania. And I first read the book in the early 1990s, and I was amused by it and kind of amazed at the descriptions of how entire societies went crazy over stocks and tulips and other financial instruments. But I didn't think it was terribly relevant at the time until about 3 or 4 years later, when it seemed that the entire Western world went gaga over internet stocks. You couldn't go to a party, you couldn't step into a cab without hearing stories about how the person you were talking to was getting rich investing in tech stocks. And so I had seen the movie, I knew how it ended, and the book saved me a lot of money. But I found, as I researched the subject some more, that this had been going on for a very long time. People had been reading the book and had been forewarned by it. Most famously, Bernard Baruch, who read the book in the early part of the 20th century and was able to suss out both the mania of the early 1900s as well as of the 1920s leading up to the 1929 crash. And he was so impressed by the book and grateful for it that he wrote the introduction to the 1932 printing of the book. So that was the first shoe that dropped. The other shoe that dropped was the rise of the Islamic State in the early 2010s, and particularly its ability to attract people from the prosperous Western world to fight and die in one of the worst places in the world, in northern Syria and Iraq. And it turns out that the way that the Islamic State did that is by deploying in a very compelling end times narrative that in many ways is nearly identical to that deployed by Christian evangelicals today. So at that point, I realized I was going to have to write an updated version of Mackay's book and tie it into some modern neuroscience and social psychology as well to explain the things that Mackay wrote about.
He wrote in the 1840s, right?
Correct, yeah. The first edition of the book was published in 1841. By the way, it has been continuously in print ever since.
So we do want to talk about this end times and how it's used, but your book talks about get-rich scenes, financial bubbles, Bitcoin, flying saucers, and isn't it too bad that the Silicon Valley Bank investors hadn't read your book? Briefly, is what happened there an example of crowd delusion?
In a mild degree, I suppose. You had a group of people who were all working in the same business milieu, who convinced themselves that Silicon Valley Bank was a straight-up institution that was managing their deposits well, and they didn't kick the tires and look under the hood. It wasn't so much a mass delusion, so much as a mass amnesia.
So we want to talk about these group manias that your book mentions, and we want to talk about religion. But first, you are postulating in your book that there is an explanation, an evolutionary explanation for crowd manias. Can you briefly explain that?
There are two things going on. The very first thing is that we evolved in the late Pleistocene era as a species to imitate each other. And all you have to think about to illustrate that is to think about the fact that between about 11,000 years ago and maybe 5,000 years ago, our forebears crossed over the Bering Strait into the New World and extended all the way down into the southern tip of South America over a relatively brief period of time. And along the way, they had to learn how to build kayaks and igloos in the high Arctic, how to hunt bison on the Great Plains, and finally, how to make poison blowguns in the Amazon. Now, all of those things are almost impossible to do if you've never seen them done before. And so the way that we learn to do those things is to imitate the other people who, by accident or hook or by crook, or more likely by evolution over centuries, learned how to do those things. So Mother Nature selected our species, in our species, the ability to imitate, which has enormous survival value in a state of nature, but unfortunately proves profoundly maladaptive in the financial markets as well as in the field of religion. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's going on is that we are a narrative species. That's how we understand things. So when two hunters went out to hunt woolly mammoths back 10,000 years ago, they didn't issue each other mathematical vectors. They said, you go right, I'll go left, and we'll spear the beast from both sides. So we have a proclivity to consume stories over and to privilege those over data. Now, what are the most compelling narratives that you can come up with? Well, the first one is, of course, the story of the end of the world. We attend to bad news. So you combine that with our proclivity for narratives, and the story of how the world ends is something that you see in all three Abrahamic religions as well as in Eastern religions as well. The second most appealing story is the story, a narrative that you can spin, is the story of how you're going to get rich by investing in stocks without any effort at all, or tulip bulbs or crypto or real estate or what have you. So that's how you tie together religious manias and financial manias.
And your book also talks about confirmation bias.
That's, again, the innate ability or proclivity we have to ignore things that contradict our worldview and to only focus on the things that confirm our worldview. And so you have something that you occasionally see called the boomerang effect, which is that when you are confronted with contradictory data that contradicts your worldview, you not only tend to reject it, but sometimes people will even double down and affirm their opinions even more strongly after they've seen contradictory data.
So what you're saying is, to sum it up, we did not evolve kayak making. We did not evolve poison dart making, but we did evolve a flexible creativity, and then the quickness to imitate other people and be a part of a group and learn quickly. So that's what's happening with these group thinking, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why, for example, everybody who's a member of a given congregation believes that they're the only ones who are going to be saved, and everybody else is going to hell. It's a wonderful way of affirming your worth in society.
That's what I used to preach. We were the chosen people.
So do people think and act differently when they're in a group rather than individually? And it said there's a wisdom in crowds, yet the masses are prone to delusion. So what's going on there?
What you find is that when people arrive at their opinions and estimates and forecasts independently, they actually do a pretty good job. And even better than that is to average all of those together. So the very first person who realized this was a man by the name of Francis Galton, an Englishman, who basically invented actuarial science all by himself. And he goes to a poultry and livestock fair around Plymouth, England, and there was a guess the weight of the ox contest. You had to guess the weight of an ox after it had been slaughtered and dressed. So you're looking at this live ox, and you have to guess what it's finally going to weigh out at after it's been prepared for slaughter. And he had people mail in postcards where they estimated the weight. And what he found was that the average, when you averaged all of those estimates together, that it was off by exactly 1 pound from the true weight of the ox, which was actually more accurate than any individual estimate. Now, that's the wisdom of crowds. Now, a finance colleague of mine by the name of Joel Greenblatt did a wonderful variation of that experiment where he got a jar of jelly beans, 776 jelly beans, and he showed it to a group of elementary school pupils, and he had them estimate the number of jelly beans. And they were, came within like 1% of the right number. But when he then asked them to guess again and to voice their opinions about the number of jelly beans in public, they were off by 50%.
So what's going on there? When your rational ability is affected or corrupted by listening to people around you, you change your opinions?
Exactly. This ability or this proclivity we have to imitate starts to fire up, and it takes us off the wrong track. And the experiment par excellence that demonstrated that was performed by a psychologist by the name of Solomon Asch, who had people perform a very simple comparative visual task, matching line lengths basically on cards. And he found that, when they did it all on their own, they were right about 98% of the time. But when they were in a group of people who estimated the answers incorrectly, that their accuracy went south. It went down to about 60 or 70%. So when we form ourselves into groups, our judgment just goes to hell.
Wow.
So William, in your book, you write, arguably the most important transformation in American cultural and political life in the last century was the rise of Evangelical Protestantism, which presents profound risks for American policy in the Middle East and for the command and control of strategic weapons. That's scary sounding, so tell us more.
Well, this is a long and complex story. It starts back in the mid-19th century, with a man by the name of John Nelson Darby, who is this dry Protestant theologian who wrote a lot of boring books trying to make sense of the Bible. And his way of thinking, called premillennial dispensationalism, was crafted and modified over the ensuing decades and over the ensuing century and a half into a very compelling narrative about how the world ends. And very briefly, the narrative goes something like this, which is that the Jews returned to Israel, which happened, which made it more believable. And then they build the third temple, and that which hasn't happened, fortunately, which then triggers a global conflict, which it would. Christ returns to earth. And there is this horrible tribulation, which is basically described as a nuclear war. But fortunately, if you've found Jesus, you are raptured up to heaven before it all goes down. So you and your fellow believers are saved and everybody else burns. Now, the really interesting part of that is the part of the Jews in this, because the state of Israel is part of this narrative. And what happens in that narrative is that a third of Jews see the light and accept Jesus and proselytize, and they also they escape the tribulation. I don't think they're raptured. But the other 2/3, well, too bad for them. Okay, so that's this really bizarre narrative. And if you describe that narrative, and I've done this to secular, my secular friends and relatives, their jaws sort of drop. Okay, but if you describe it to a Christian evangelical, well, it's like you're describing the plot to Ocean's 11 or Gone with the Wind. It's something that's part of their culture.
Well, even people like President Reagan understood dispensationalism. Isn't that correct?
Yes, he did. And there was this rather remarkable moment in the 1984 debate with, I think, Walter Mondale, where someone actually asked him about that. One of the moderators asked them about that, and you could just see Nancy Reagan's face fall, going, "Oh no, oh no." And fortunately, Ronald Reagan, the raconteur that he was able to deflect it pretty well.
When we come back, we want to talk with you about why you say humans mold the facts to fit our pre-existing opinions and not the other way around.
We'll be back with more Freethought Matters with William J. Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace.
Let's restore respect for America's secular roots. Help the Freedom from Religion Foundation defend the wall of separation between state and church. Join us at FFRF.org. Freedom depends on freethinkers.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with William J. Bernstein, author of the book, The Delusions of Crowds, Why People Go Mad in Groups.
And William, during the break, we were talking about the division right now in our country, and you had some interesting thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, what is happening in the United States, and to a lesser extent, I think, in other countries, but primarily in the United States, is people are now, for the very first time, self-segregating themselves geographically. So, it used to be when you lived in a town, there was the rich banker, there were the working people, there were the ne'er-do-wells, and everybody sort of lived together, and you had to come to a common agreement in the body politic about how things would run with very different people. Well, what is now happening in the United States is that people are self-segregating themselves by culture and political belief geographically. So if you're a liberal, you're not going to move to Lubbock, Texas, okay? And if you're an evangelical conservative, you're not moving to Portland, Oregon, or Manhattan. okay? And so what we see politically is this polarization, and the way that you can really see it is in the number of landslide counties and landslide cities, cities in which the electoral margins, say, exceed 20%. The number of those locales has increased dramatically over the past couple of decades. So remember that we all imitate the people around us. And if the people around us increasingly look like us, then we're all living in our own little bubble chambers, and we're polarizing and not communicating with each other.
I do know that there are some liberals in Lubbock, Texas. There's six of them, I think.
Well, we have members of the Freedom from Religion Foundation there, certainly. So, yeah, that's a scary thought.
That is good to hear.
So in your book, William, you say, when presented with facts and data that contradict our deeply held beliefs, we generally do not reconsider and alter those beliefs appropriately. And why is that? And if facts don't work, then how can we encourage someone to reconsider these deeply held beliefs?
Well, modern neuropsychology gives us some answers into that. There are two psychologists, Stanovich and West, who basically labeled our two brain systems, if you will, System 1 and System 2. And what are they? Well, System 1 is our reptile brain, our limbic system. It's our emotional brain. It's how we come to very rapid moral judgments. And then System 2 is the overlying neocortex, basically the outer, very crudely, the outer layer of our brain, which is our thinking brain, which is very new evolutionarily. It's only a couple 100,000 years old, at least in the way it functions in human beings. And we flatter ourselves that by telling ourselves that, our System 2 dominates our System 1. But in fact, what any psychologist will tell you is that System 1 leads System 2. We come to these emotionally based moral judgments, and we use our rational System 2 simply to explain them or rationalize them. So the bottom line is we're not really as rational as we think we are. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, puts it very succinctly. He said that System 2, that is our rational facility, is merely System 1's press agent.
So when you're afraid, doesn't that kind of undercut your System 2 critical abilities? Like, I'm going to go to hell, or there's going to be a nuclear war. Doesn't fear tend to kind of take center stage?
That's the most obvious cause of it. It's good that you point that out, that when you're afraid, your System 1 really starts to dominate your thinking. But there's something else that's more subtle and just as important, which is that narratives corrode the ability of your System 2 to dominate System 1. So when you listen to compelling narratives, when you read a good novel or a good short story, or you hear a compelling political narrative, that completely overwhelms your rational facilities.
Well, hopefully we can tell some rational stories.
In your book, you repeat the old joke that says a delusion that's shared by hundreds of people is called a cult. But a delusion shared by millions of people, it's called a religion. Why is a cult often despised, but we're never supposed to criticize a religion?
Well, it's simply because when you have a religion, you have millions of people who agree with you, okay? And it's hard, especially if everybody around you has the same belief system, it's hard to disconfirm or disbelieve that. On the other hand, there are a couple of people out there who have a system which is just as bizarre as yours, but there are only a couple hundred of them. It's easy to otherize them, to demonize them.
So, William, what about people who are rebels, who don't care what other people think of them? Are they more rational, or is there something else going on there?
There is no question that there are some people who have that tendency, people who tend to be iconoclasts. But for every iconoclast out there, there are at least 100 conformists. And you could see that, for example, and we talked yesterday about what happened in the Nazi death camps. Most of the people who worked there were ordinary, decent, upstanding people who you really wouldn't pick out from a group as being particularly evil or malevolent. But maybe 1 out of 100 of them did rebel but they were, a very small group of people in the majority. The same thing happened at Me Live, for example. That's a classic example where one service member, he was a gunner, a sergeant, basically put his machine gun on Cali and Medina and said, if you shoot any more civilians, I'm shooting you. All right, he did the right thing.
Yeah.
And in Vietnam, he's a hero. But in the American military, a lot of people reviled him, even to this day.
Wow.
Wow.
So your book, we don't have time to talk about all the stories, but your book goes into the history of a lot of these crazes and manias, financial bubbles and religious movements. And there's a lot of humor in the book, too. There seems to be an overrepresentation of flying saucer cults. Is there something about flying saucers that's attractive to people? Or?
Well, it's a good end of the world narrative. Okay, this was a small flying saucer cult in the Chicago area, and it was made famous because it became the subject of a famous psychological book called "When Prophecy Fails" by a psychologist by the name of Leon Festinger, and he actually came across this flying saucer cult when it was actually in motion and was in the process of being disconfirmed. And it was just one more end of the world narrative, that the world was going to end, the earth was going to shake and opened up, people were going to die, but flying saucers were going to come and rescue the believers. It was just a variation on the religious end times narratives.
So we're almost out of time. We want to give you a chance to make some conclusions for our viewers.
Well, I guess the conclusion I would make is that we are evolutionarily primed to delude ourselves in large crowds and to conform to the people around us. And I guess the moral that I would give to all of us is listen to people on the other side of the argument. Always listen to your ideological and religious opponents and listen to what they have to say and think about it and try to think about it as rationally as you can and try and put yourself in their position. I'm politically liberal, but I read the National Review. I even look at Fox News because occasionally, believe it or not, they do have useful things to say.
Well, thank you. So basically, think for yourself. Thank you, William J. Bernstein, for writing a wonderful book, The Delusions of Crowds. And thank you for being with us today on Freethought Matters.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.